lots of familiar faces also. So glad to see you, glad to be here. And thanks very much for joining this session. I'm going to share screen now for our presentation today. Can you see?
Yes, it is showing.
Yeah, okay, very good. So thanks for the warm welcome. We're delighted to be here. And here's a quick overview of what we're doing in the remaining time. We went through the introduction, and we'll talk a little bit more about the results of the survey that some of you have been responded to for this session, for this series of sessions. Then Warren will take it away to talk about what action media actually is and how it has evolved. I will take another 20 minutes. We need some timekeepers here also to talk about how action media has been applied to SPC programming. We'll definitely make time for Q&A, questions and answers, which I hope you have many. And maybe you can, while we are presenting, add them into the chat so that we already have, your questions right away and can observe them while we're presenting. And then at the end, we'll quickly talk about, what the next session will be about and how it responds to the survey results. Everybody okay? All right. So quick overview. Thanks for the fabulous presentation of the results of the survey that was done. It gives us a good overview and realization that action media methodology is somewhat known, but that there's quite a mix of understanding. It looks as if there's a lot of basic understanding, but not as much advanced or intermediate, which is something we can address today a little bit more. It also looks as if there's various areas of action media that people would like to have better understanding of, which includes stakeholder engagement, strategic planning, practical skills, and most of all conceptual understanding, which again is something I think we can do today with Warren's presentation and mine about the application. And with that, I'm handing over to Warren to take us away.
Great, thanks so much, Antje, and it's great to be here. Thanks very much to SBC for hosting this series of workshops. I think it's good timing in terms of action media. Although action media has been around for a long time, it continues to be applied and is often seen as quite a novel approach to developing communication and change programming. We can go to the next slide. So I'm going to be covering the evolution of action media, when it started and how it's kind of evolved over time, the key principles and practice guidelines for implementing action media, and then I'll talk about a sociocultural change model that's been derived from various iterations of action media and programs that have applied action media to guide programming. So firstly, action media started out in the early 1990s, actually, as part of my master's thesis, where I was particularly concerned with critiquing top-down communication and expert-led approaches to health communication. So this is in the context of the emerging HIV epidemic in South Africa. HIV communication was largely led by advertising agencies and government, but in a very top-down way. And there didn't seem to be alternatives to shaping communication that had some kind of grounding in the lives of audiences. So in exploring that research question, I worked with young people living in Soweto, a township near Johannesburg, and also youth attending a tertiary college in Johannesburg. And it seemed to me that the best approach would be obviously a qualitative approach, but to draw on participatory action research methods and to see if I could adapt them into applying this type of thinking in conceptualizing communication initially. So the advantage of participatory action research is that it stimulates dialogue, reflection, and critical thinking. And it's very useful to support insights into change processes and into communication to support change. So that was the broad starting point. On the left, sorry, you can just go back for a second. You'll see a photograph there of a poster that says Viva Condoms. So that was the first outcome of the participatory approach using the initial action media formulation. And that poster happened to be scaled up nationally. Millions were eventually printed to support the HIV response in South Africa. So it just shows that a small interaction using this type of approach can actually produce scalable concepts. Okay, we can move on. So let's have a look now at the principles of action media. So as mentioned, it's essentially a participatory action research methodology. It follows an open-ended co-learning process between researchers and participants to deepen understanding of how people make meaning in their lives. So this is a core aspect of participatory action research. You dig into the social and cultural context of people's lived experiences. It acknowledges that ordinary people have critical capacities and insights into their lived experiences that include identifying problems, solutions, and pathways for change to improve their lives. And I think here it's a question of trusting that audiences and people on the ground actually have important insights and can inform the types of things that are typically reserved for experts and people in the kind of upper strata of health and communication development, among other aspects of development. So the approach is essentially concerned with empowering people through dialogue and reflection, and building ownership and leadership of low-cost solutions. So the types of things that emerge from action media and participatory action research focus on ownership and sustainable low-cost types of approaches. So through applying these participatory action research principles, action media emerged as a replicable methodology. So in the period of the 90s, I applied it mostly to work that was ongoing in South Africa. We can move to the next one. So if we think about the key elements of the methodology, so it's essentially a formative research activity or program-related inquiry. It's typically used in those two types of contexts. It sets out to support social and cultural change processes and communication for health and development. So it's got quite a broad application. Initially, it was used widely just in health, but it's being used much more widely now in development, education, and other types of thematic areas. It's typically applied to develop insights for improving health or development and for informing funded projects that seek to strengthen their social and behavior change strategies. So a lot of the entities that are conducting action media are funded projects and programs, but also research inquiries that look to developing models. So that's another aspect of implementation. So participants are connected through common circumstances in a given context. So the representatives of participants that are involved in the action media research process include other commonalities or specific commonalities, such as common health risks, maybe in relation to HIV or reproductive health or diseases such as malaria. They may be involved in illegal or marginalized activities such as sex work and drug use. There may be marginalized or disempowered subpopulations, including youth, migrants, people with low literacy, people living in poverty, adolescents, LGBT plus people, amongst others. Or there may be people facing economic challenges such as fisherfolk, rural farmers, unemployed people. So action media is particularly useful for engaging with subpopulations that are marginalized in one way or another, or vulnerable to health challenges or other challenges. Action media is typically conducted in or near the communities where participants live or work. The standard group of participants is 15 people, usually mixed by gender and to some extent by age, and then by the characteristics that I've referred to. And the action research process or the action media process typically takes 2 full days and 1 half day. There have been instances where we run it over 3.5 days. and instances where we do a kind of light version that's over 2 days. But ideally, the sort of standard approach is 2.5 days. It's led by researchers and communication professionals with participatory action research skills, and that would be skills including facilitation and particularly requiring people to have strong skills in qualitative research. But it's not necessarily required that you have extensive experience in PAR. It can be introduced to researchers and communication professionals who've just got qualitative research skills. The research roles in conducting action media include the facilitator, a co-facilitator, an interpreter, because we always work in the language of the participants in the first instance, someone who documents and takes notes and operates the recorders, an artist. Sometimes that role doesn't need to be there, but it's typically there. And administrative support to organize logistics such as refreshments and so on. And then obviously, once you've got the data, you need to translate and transcribe it as with any other qualitative research. The activities of action media are guided by a formal research protocol, and that protocol typically gets submitted to an ethical review board, so you consider ethics as well, and the formalization is fairly standard in any research, but it could be bypassed in some instances when you're doing particular types of program research. There is some latitude there, but essentially it's a formally guided process using a protocol. So if we think about the other elements of the methodology, so obviously if you're going to be working in communities, you need to be thinking about community entry. So you can't just go and apply this methodology in or near a community without engaging in a community entry process, typically engaging with community leaders and key stakeholders prior to implementation. Since it's a highly visible activity, you're going to bring 15 people together plus a team of researchers in or near a venue in the community. People are going to be curious about it and want to know your reason for being there and so forth. So the entry part is important. Recruitment is typically led through local organizations or program staff or community leaders and stakeholders. And I think what we need to recognize here is we're asking participants to be available for 2.5 days. So there's certain dynamics involved in achieving that. It is possibly a limitation of the research that it does require this extent of time from participants. But in implementing action media across countries and globally, it's never really been a problem to get that level of participation. The participants are informed about the requirements and the ethical considerations before they participate. Participants are supported. If you're working with women, often women have childcare responsibilities or even parents have childcare responsibilities and may want to bring young children, toddlers to the sessions, and arrangements can be made for that. Because of the duration of the action media sessions, meals and refreshments are provided and stipends are provided as well. When it comes to the venue, one is interested in having a covered space with movable seating and space for large and small group discussions, possibly breakout areas, free from excessive noise or interruption. So these types of venues are typically available in communities. They could be gazebos, they could be school halls, they could be school classrooms, they could be church venues and so forth. There is usually a space that is suitable for this, but you can go so far as conducting action media under the shelter of a tree or any other community space, depending on where you are. The equipment is very basic. You basically need digital recorders with some spare batteries, flip charts, stands, sheets, pens, notebooks, tables, wall space if available, and then a smartphone and a computer, and that's about it. So not very complicated technology to support. You can move on.
One moment, sorry.
Okay, sure.
Something is stuck here. Okay, there we go.
All right. So another key thing is that you really need to be working in the language of the local participants. So to do that, depending on whether the researchers or research team include a facilitator or co-facilitator who speaks the local language, you would integrate translation and interpretation as part of the process, as relevant. And the fact that this is built into the methodology means that it can be run anywhere in the world using this particular approach, because you're not limited by language. So that's within the system of the methodology, and it works very efficiently. So I've done action media in many different countries, in many instances not speaking the local language, and we managed to move the process ahead. A key part of participatory action research and action media is building trust with the participants very quickly, getting a sense of mutual collaboration between this outside group of researchers and communication professionals and the participants, who also may not know each other. So to make a co-learning process work, we use icebreakers, games, energizers, role plays. We share meals, so there's no question of when refreshments are served. People sit in separate groups and so forth according to where they come from, and essentially focus a lot on building mutual respect between all participants to ensure a co-learning space. And that again can be achieved quite efficiently, and it's very interesting to observe how this trust builds up over time, and by the end of the action media sessions, people are hugely comfortable with each other and freely share thoughts and so forth. One needs to recognize local practices. So in many instances, meetings are opened with a prayer in whatever faith it might be, Christian, Muslim, or any other one. And one also considers inequalities and power relations. So what are the inequalities and power relations dominant in the community, for example, gender and so forth? And you just take that into account. The focus is on empowering participants as well. So that is achieved through a combination of large group discussions where one talks about general questions or reports back on findings from sub-discussions. And then a lot of the power of action media is really built into small group work, where of the group of 15 people, we work in groups of 5 that are independent groups or teams that are sustained throughout the action media process. But specifically, there's no facilitator present. So people can work independently and build confidence in sharing ideas and so on in the language of their choice. And this teamwork process really strengthens and empowers subgroups of participants who then stand up and present their findings on flip chart sheets and through other means. For participants who have low literacy, in some instances, they sort of remember and share their findings. In other instances, we may situate a note taker with a small group just to take notes. So it works across literacy as well. It doesn't require that people are literate and are able to take notes of their small group discussions. And this again is another strength of the methodology, that there's no requirement that people have to be literate, particularly. There are ways around it. But the core thing really is this empowerment process. And then knowledge is built up iteratively. So in conventional qualitative research, such as a focus group or an interview, you're going to jump in and go straight to the point, because obviously there's not a lot of time and you've got a specific research interest. In action media and participatory research in general, knowledge is built up iteratively. So you don't really rush into the research question right in the beginning. You get a really good understanding of the context, of people's values and interests and challenges, and then build up into pursuing the specific research questions and lines of inquiry. So again, that's allowed for by the fact that action media takes place over a number of days. And then obviously all activities are documented, so use recorders, flip chart sheets, photographs, videos. So there's a way of ensuring that everything is said, or that everything that takes place in the sessions is documented for research write-up. So a key focus obviously is looking at the context, people's challenges, priorities, and opportunities for change. So another key feature of this type of approach is that as researchers or communication specialists, you might go in there with a set of priorities related to your program interests or project interests or whatever else related to your research question. But it's very useful to weigh that against what people's actual priorities are. So we look at what people see as being gaps and challenges in their community, what things they want to change, and we weigh those against the research question. The advantage of that is it allows unknowns to emerge. Often one finds out new things or insights or perspectives that are unexpected, but that actually are critical to the research question. And through the process of dialogue and reflection, people build up understanding and look for solutions to problems or share solutions to problems. So a lot of the solutions to problems can be derived from people on the ground in their context through their cultural framework. Integration of communication elements. So initially, my inquiry that led to the development of Action Media in the first instance was around communication. But as you'll see, it's very much more now related to social change processes, cultural change processes, and communication as a tool to support that, or a mechanism to support that. So as far as the communication pieces go, we include activities such as mapping, drawings, note-taking, illustrations, role-playing, building on local proverbs, developing slogans, integrating ideas into manifestos, and using folk media such as songs and so on, and visualizations to support thinking about communication. And this really provides an understanding of how people receive information, how people engage with information, how people make meaning. And then it informs SBC ultimately if it's a program, if it's integrated in the program strategy. One of the other important things is to understand how people see themselves in relation to the future, what they want to change, how they might be able to change it, how they might organize themselves to bring about change, actions for change, roles and responsibilities, values and principles, resources and channels for communicating. And this is essentially, it's essential to all SBC work. We're interested in change processes. How do you bring about change? How do you mobilize change? So these insights at this small group level are relevant not only for communities of similar kinds, but also scalable using these principles to projects and programs that work at a higher level than just community level. A manifesto or a pledge is a very useful way to bring the vision for the future together with the actions and commitments necessary for change. So thinking again about the process, the key findings from the first 2 days, day 1 and day 2, really bring together concepts for change linked to change processes and communication. And at the end of that 2-day process, and in fact, in the evenings of day 1 and 2, the research team would get together and debrief and organize the data, and then consolidate findings for a reflection process on the 3rd day in the afternoon. So on the 3rd day in the afternoon, participants and researchers look through the findings, share and refine concepts of change, look at visualizations and communication, review possible actions that would bring about change and how one would organize to carry change forward. So that is the third day, the afternoon, in rounding off the findings, very much focused on change and communication. The next steps obviously are to translate and transcribe the audio data, and then to use that data along with other visual and other data that's emerged from the Action Media process to write up the research report. And typically one's going to use the findings to inform an SBC strategy. So as far as informing SBC strategies, Action Media supports project design or revision to sharpen activities and strengthen outcomes. Typically, Action Media is conducted at the beginning of programs or projects, or at some midpoint if people are not sure about the direction or the effectiveness of what's being done as far as SBC goes. As mentioned, Action Media has been used in diverse themes and looking at diverse concerns. It connects context to culture and change processes by deepening understanding well beyond what can typically be achieved by other qualitative methods. So because of this time process and the participatory action element, the depth of information that you get out of action media is considerable. But it doesn't mean it's the only method you would use. You may include complementary research such as stakeholder interviews or focus group discussions. Findings are typically generalizable to other similar communities, but also nationally and even across country. So Antje will share later some examples of how the findings from action media have been applied to multi-country contexts. It's suitable for skills transfer, so it's not a methodology that's so highly specialized that only a few people can carry it out. Through my work conducting action media, in many instances, it includes training of researchers and communication practitioners who then themselves go on to carry out action media iterations in their countries or within their projects and programs. So it's a transferable research methodology. It's cost effective with rapid turnaround. So it may seem like there's some costs associated with action media, but when you compare it to the kind of data you would need to gather through focus groups or interviews, it's incredibly cost effective in comparison. And the findings involve a rapid turnaround of insights. The methodology is replicable, so it's been conducted hundreds of times, I guess, over the period of years with consistent results. So it shows that you can replicate it. I'm just very quickly going to talk about one project. Antje will speak about a few more, and throughout this series, we'll actually be sharing examples of even more iterations of action media. But I thought this one was a particularly good example. It was a project called Prevention in Action that was carried out from 2009 to 2012 in South Africa. And the project started out around the assumption that gender-based violence or violence against women was largely driven by a set of by social norms, the beliefs amongst people that this type of violence was acceptable in one way or another. And the program focused on changing those norms initially, but when it was realized that people didn't actually agree with these so-called norm statements, action media was brought into trying to understand what was going on. And in doing so, we found that the real challenge was not that people accepted violence against women or gender-based violence, but that they didn't know what to do. And that silence or that inaction sustained incidents of violence. So through action media, we developed an understanding of what could be done and how people saw change processes, and the focus of the program then shifted to stimulating this process of taking action whenever violence against women or gender-based violence was encountered. And through that process, we ended up with hundreds and hundreds of actions that people had taken independently by themselves. We documented those and shared those. The communication support included a logo, slogan, a manifesto, and other small media. This whole process of revealing the actions that could be taken led to change processes being perpetuated extensively. You'll see on the right, there's a sticker that's on a household door, which represents a violence-free home. So that was a simple way for people to commit at a family level. Also on the right, there's someone signing a manifesto. So the manifesto has mapped out the core beliefs and people could adhere to them. And then on the left, ultimately what happened was the project transitioned to the point where community members themselves said, we would like to establish violence-free zones in our communities that we'll manage ourselves. So that was that process. And on the left, our logo happened to have these multiple colors, and people painted many areas of the community in the colors of the logo to symbolize the community response. Okay, so I'll quickly go to the sociocultural model that's been derived from action media work, and then we'll move on to Antje's section of the presentation. So this model here particularly informs the kinds of things you need to address when you're doing social and behavior change or social and cultural change. And so you can check if your activities connect into this. But firstly, change is only going to happen if people see it as beneficial. And it needs to be seen as beneficial not only at the individual level, but at the social level. So you're not going to produce social or cultural change without this acknowledgement that change is important beyond the individual level. So many health, communication, other interventions focus on the individual only, and that really doesn't produce a social change process. Then change needs to be seen as necessary. So to make it necessary, it needs to be consistent with community values and community defined needs. So you're not going to produce change if that link is not made. Change is meaningful and goal oriented. So people need to be able to see a future or a new future related to the change process, the change that makes a difference. So that needs to be addressed. And then it needs to be practical and actionable with tangible outcomes. So change is only going to happen if people can make change and they can see the outcomes in a relatively short space of time. So if we break that down further, your SBC or change process needs to be community owned and driven. It needs to be consistent with the context and culture of people. It needs to be sustainable. And this is another thing that's often not thought about at the outset of programs, but is what we're doing sustainable to the extent that if the project ends, which they often do, are we leaving something behind that's sustainable? And if it is sustainable, it will be transformative. So iterating these change processes actually changes the sociocultural circumstances of people and often the material circumstances. As far as communication goes, communication is there to articulate the needs, a vision for the future and pathways to action. So that's where it provides support to the change process. It builds on values to support identification as a social actor. And action media is particularly revealing for how one would do that, how you build on values, how you get people to identify with change. And then it stimulates ongoing change through sharing narratives of action. So if you're going to make change happen, you need to share information about instances of change, how people have changed or how communities are changing through various processes. So I'll round off there, and I'm very happy to hand over now to Antje, who will expand on what we've talked about here. Thanks so much.
So hi everyone. That was a lot for now, and I'm wondering if you can start adding your questions already in the chat, so that we can pick that up quickly. I'm, trying to not take up too much more time, but can give you a couple of examples of how action media has been applied. Everybody still okay? Thumbs up? Yeah, I see some of them. Okay, great. All right, so please add your questions. Very good. I'm going to talk about action media's advantages from my vantage point as a hefty implementer, and give some examples and go into some lessons learned to feed into, I think some of the survey requests to be kind of practically, to be applied. And now okay, here we go. Sometimes it gets stuck here. But to talk about action media's advantages for SPC programming, as you've heard already, it is an in-depth formative research method for SPC programs that we've used quite a bit. It also fills gaps in existing evidence. So it's also often, comes together with a literature review of existing evidence, trying to figure out where do we need more understanding of the complexity of the situation. It does explore, as Warren said, individual, but also collective practices, which is important for community engagement strategies. Goes into social and gender norms, and also includes, what structural barriers communities are experiencing with regard to change that projects may require. And what I find really important is how people perceive their own context. How do they understand what's going on? And if change is something they see for themselves. What I like about it is that it uses an asset-based approach, and often, when Warren and others performed action media research, it was focusing on community values, which we could then compare with existing actions, which is, a great motivator at community level, actually. The unfacilitated group exercises in local languages and also in dialects often uncover contextual issues that normal focus groups won't, and even human-centered design often doesn't, because it kind of sticks more to individual level processes. So these are very important, and they're quite different from what I've seen before. It is a rapid, so fast and cost-effective method that is replicable because it's based on protocol development. So it's a bit more sturdy than just key informant interviews or focus groups and other activities. And what is important is that data can be triangulated with base and end lines as a pre and post, which is really important to do so that you have qualitative understanding of the complexity of the issue, but also quantitative data, and it can be applied at scale. Here's a quick example, even though somewhat older, from application of action media at scale. Some of you may remember under Sea Change, we developed the community conversation toolkit, and it did start with an action media exercise to develop an interactive toolkit with people with low literacy to address HIV prevention at the time. And we did hear from our action media exercise that people clearly wanted a tool that used local languages, idioms, and their proverbs to foster direct discussion. That was in Limpopo, South Africa, where we started. They wanted to have short text with more visual elements than usual. They wanted something to use in their social time, games to support problem solving. And the most interesting part was that they wanted something unfacilitated. They were sick of experts coming into communities, and including peer educators that often had an attitude of, we know what you need to do, and then applied a top-down approach. They wanted creative activities such as role plays that they could perform themselves to make sense of HIV and the consequences thereof. And they clearly requested graphic consequences in the visuals of certain behaviors and scenarios. And with that, the Community Conversation Toolkit was born. I'm holding up here one of the tools, which is this cube that you see there with proverbs. There is no pleasure without pain. What does that mean for HIV prevention? These are discussion starters that worked really well. There was a community mobilization little guide, finger puppets, playing cards with questions, and all kinds of other tactile kind of elements in the box. And what is still holding up, I think, to this day is also the process of scale up that we used, and we could allow ourselves because that was a global SPC project. We basically developed the ideas during an action media workshop in one place, which happened to be South Africa, refined and concept tested with the same group that we had started. But then we mocked up a refined regional prototype and assessed through concept testing in 4 countries, namely Malawi, Namibia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, and then further refined based on that feedback. So we started with audiences, and then we went to stakeholders, stakeholder review in all of those countries, including NGO, government staff, and donors, which was really interesting because the pretest showed that people loved what we had prototyped, whereas the stakeholders were really skeptical and had to be a lot more convinced because there were some unusual elements in there, and especially the idea of having an unfacilitated toolkit really didn't sit right with a lot of people, especially stakeholders. But that was the element that was actually made it so popular among the audiences. So a really interesting process. The final adapted toolkits were translated in local languages for final pretest. And in the end, we had adaptations in 7 countries, 9 languages, used by a total of 41 NGOs. And in some of the community level activities, toolkits were even stolen from each other because the box was actually really quite popular. I think probably because it was so tactile, because it was things we could throw, finger puppets, work with, lots of things that could be used in different ways, non-prescriptive. We finished the whole process up with monitoring and evaluation, and Soul City was very instrumental with their local partners to train CBO staff, peer educators, which monitored the implementation of the community conversations and the action planning in 2 countries. And then an evaluation of all of that explored how partners and peer educators, but also the dialogue participants perceived this activity, how practical the toolkit was to use, and what the outcomes were of the dialogue and engagement processes. On the right side, on the left side, you see a quote of, someone appreciating again that this toolkit really invited participation of all and did not follow another top-down approach. In the results, we saw that the participants supported changes beyond the dialogue sometimes. There were organizations that worked to find funding for the action plans. And overall, the evaluation validated that it was a non-traditional SPC approach that spurred homegrown solutions with a focus on relationship and fostering critical group thinking, which obviously, held people's attention a lot more than the previous approaches. Another more recent example is the Apollo project in Karamoja, just recently ended. Started in 2018 with formative research, and we also used action media, and some of the participants here were intimately involved in the development of this project design, its strategy and implementation. And we started with action media at the beginning, and the insights shaped the strategic approach quite heavily, and also the materials development and the channel choices. But we also used key insights again during the revision of the strategy and when the entire project pivoted to work more through local structures. We had a final assessment that then confirmed proof of concept of the strategy quite well, and I can give you a couple of more glimpses of this activity. One of the main insights is something that you're looking at here. The story of the goat. One of the participants in action media talked about that there is theft in our community because of jealousy. There are people who feel bad when one person has something. I was given the goat by an NGO program. They called me, and I put a Karamojong traditional attire on and was photographed with the goat. Someone took the goat to take to the kraal, and it was stolen. After some time, I was given 4 goats. When they were grazing, someone stole them all. And in response to the story, the participants reflected on the causes of theft and opportunities to address the problem. And it was noted that non-governmental organizations and government entities were not transparent when it came to selecting beneficiaries. And this led to theft by those who were not beneficiaries. And furthermore, local councils were suspected of registering their relatives for program benefits, leading to jealousy among those who were not registered. And as a solution, it was suggested that households could work together on food production and then share the benefits between them. And in this way, no one would bother to steal. So this is just one of the examples of, what action media uncovered. And what is important for programs like ours is that obviously, individual success stories in this collectivist society didn't really work, and they invited unwanted, and unanticipated results. And this is very important for us to know up front. And hence we reacted on the mistrust and theft topics, on unpredictable climate issues, livelihood and poverty issues, water, sanitation and hygiene issues, undernutrition and gender inequality, with various approaches to increase trust and collaboration, foster collective efficacy through group activities, strengthen families and community, introduce new knowledge, but also practice in the areas of livelihoods, wash, nutrition, gender equity, work through authentic storytelling and share solutions and actions, and basically work through group and community role modeling and collective action, not so much at the individual level. So it was a real task to keep activity leads away from these individual success stories that wouldn't really work here, which we knew from the formative research. We went through 3 different vehicles because there were several different sectors involved: health, but also livelihoods, WASH, agriculture, and governance. We worked through the Manyatta wagon shows with Kenneth Mulondo and his team, where people could, through experiential interactions, get hands-on and try out new behaviors and products. We had with Irene Kulabako silent trigger videos, really fascinating methodology of short scenario videos enacted by community members silently, so that they can act more naturally and we don't have to translate everything, and so that they open up to opportunities to engage in dialogue and reflection. And often it was about what's right, what's wrong. The values are coming back in here. And then there was a radio magazine show from Paul Kavuma, where local stories were collected, how people had self-organized already to better their communities, and that was combined with myth and norm busters led by leaders and elders. And in combination, and Evelyn Nakuro is on, I just saw her coming in. She basically led a lot of this together also with others. And the final assessment findings, where we used most significant change methodology, and Warren was involved again. We found that there were various changes at gender, maternal and child health level, as well as in WASH, that went beyond increases in knowledge. There were trends. Basically, we uncovered that couples were collaborating more closely with each other. And some of the gender norms were overcome with regard to attendance during pregnancy. Overall, rape and defilement had declined. The project managed to increase the use of perma gardens, for example, and knowledge about importance of balanced diet, which was there before somewhat, was more turned into practice in terms of dietary diversity together with the livelihood activities. Same with WASH. Knowledge was there before, but now it was more turned into pragmatic adoption of WASH-related behaviors and construction of WASH infrastructure. Lessons learned is basically that this approach worked well to reach nomadic populations. We had a participatory approach to branding also, which was quite important. The non-prescriptive vehicles for integration of multiple sectors also worked quite well. There was meaningful participation, experiential learning, new skills, authentic storytelling, not storytelling, not success storytelling, but storytelling of previously self-organized activities, which was important to the strategy, and understanding of issues and change negotiated through dialogue happened with critical reflection. The pivot of the project in the end to work a lot more through existing community platforms also helped with sustainability. Now I'm coming quickly to an end, and please add your questions. General lessons learned from an implementation point of view are that triangulation with base and endline data is really important. And we could not really do that for Apollo. A lot of our indicators weren't really accepted into the base and end line. So this is something that always needs to be well negotiated. I do remember that use of action media at FHI at some time also added peer ethnography to triangulate what came back from action media. When we use action media for formative research, sometimes we start too early on the SBC material concepts that Warren called communication concepts a lot. I call them SBC. And sometimes that happens too early and needs to happen in a second step. There needs to be agreement on the detail of what action media needs to bring in from the stakeholders. In Malawi, there was a lot more detail expected than we were able to bring in the short amount of time that we had with the budget we had. So that needs to be negotiated. And sometimes the findings from action media really are also controversial. In a case in Sierra Leone, where the expectation was that there is a lot of teenage pregnancy, but the reasons for teenage pregnancy were quite different from what was expected, and Warren can tell you more about that. Again, the budget and the time is crucial for action media. If cut it too short, if we think it's too rapid and too cheap, basically, it also cannot produce results. So we can talk more about, what general budgets look like and what the timeline looks like. It's great to integrate Ministry of Health or ministerial staff in the trainings that Warren often does with teams for buy-in. In Malawi, the ministry really insisted that this is a great methodology that would like to continue, for other projects, for example. It's important not to reduce the method, and I know that came out of the survey also, to what we usually do in formative research with focus groups. It really is different, and it has certain key elements that need to be kept to keep it intact. To Warren for the last slides, and then we can really discuss. So bring in your questions, please.
Great, thanks so much, Antje. I think you've really brought home some of the ways to apply this type of research, which is critical. Action media is not a research method in and of itself, but it's got to be there to inform something. So you need to think about how you're going to apply the findings, and I think some great examples there, and there are many others. And I'm sure people on the group who've used action media could share others as well. But just to give you a sense of the diversity of application and the context, these are ones largely that I've been involved in conducting, but I've done action media in China, looking at HIV risks of drug users and young people. We've applied action media, and this is also through organizations, Antje and FHI 360 and Save the Children and other organizations have been involved in many of these processes. In the Caribbean, we looked at gay men, sex workers, and people living with HIV, their risk context and way to respond and organize. In Ghana, we've looked at sustainable fishing, reproductive health, and stigma related to gay men and sex workers. In Malawi, there was integrated programming. In South Africa, we've recently completed a multi-year research project looking at positive parenting. Action media has also been used for reducing HIV stigma. And then the example I shared around reducing gender-based violence or addressing gender-based violence. In Namibia, we also did that. In Sierra Leone, as Antje mentioned, we looked at adolescent pregnancy and ending child marriage. In Rwanda, we've got a very good program that's unfolding right now to support Kenya-Rwanda literacy in schools that's really elicited a very strong set of responses in school settings. And it's the first time this type of approach has been applied in education. So very interesting there, potentially leading to a model. Burundi, we looked at reproductive health. Côte d'Ivoire, recently looking at child labor. And pretty much in all countries where I've personally been involved in conducting action media, it has included training of researchers and practitioners. So the opportunity there is to extend the skills base for people to apply this methodology and for people to be able to peer train others in their communities or even across countries, in their countries or across countries. So just to come up to the key takeaways, I think the action media methodology is well established and it's been applied in diverse contexts. It supports insights for social cultural change and communication, and SBC, as Antje has mentioned, if one defines communication more broadly. It is a methodology with outcomes that are described in various journal articles and reports. So we'll share some of these resources as well, so you can read up further on action media, both in the journal article format and in the reports that have reported on action media applications. As I've mentioned, many researchers and communication practitioners have been trained and themselves experienced implementing action media in their country. So the examples I gave were really mostly ones I'd been directly involved in, but there are many, many more. And we continue to expand this base of people trained in the methodology. It can be used as a standalone approach of inquiry to possibly frame or thinking around a model, but more typically it's complementary to other qualitative research or other literature that's out there. As we mentioned in the protocol, you're going to be doing a literature review of what is known, so that action media is adding value and new insights rather than just reiterating findings. But typically, action media digs deeper than most methods. But you can say, well, let's do action media and some interviews and some focus groups to deepen our understanding. Timing is key. So action media is really best used as a kind of formative research vehicle at the outset of a project, or to gain insights into direction. But very often it's been applied also to projects who've maybe run for a year or two and aren't achieving what they want to achieve in SBC. And action media is a good way for reorienting thinking and possibly redirecting some of the activities or strengthening the SBC strategy.
So I think we should go into a discussion now. This last slide is still from the poll, and is talking about what people are expecting from the series of activities. So I think let's stop here and go into discussion now. Is that okay with everyone?
Great. Well, I'll kick off. One of the questions that's come up quite a bit is how do you choose the participants? How do you overcome bias in participants? I can actually put my camera on. So, hi everyone. So I think the key thing is that the people who are participants in action media are just ordinary people. You don't want people who stand out as leaders or key stakeholders or anything like that. One's really focusing on people who are ordinary people in their community. And I suppose part of the choice is which community you select to work in. So obviously that has some bearing on the themes that you're looking at, the challenges that might be evident in those communities. But in many instances, the participants are not like strongly aligned with the inquiry in the first instance. That develops over time as you dig deeper. So for example, in Ghana, we were looking at stigma leveled towards gay men and other men who have sex with men and sex workers. And in both instances, the participants we recruited were ordinary people in their communities who essentially largely strongly opposed to both those subpopulations. So that they really did not hold much value for gay men and other men who have sex with men. And they also didn't really have strong respect for sex workers. But as we dug deeper, this changed very quickly in the action media process. And people came to realize that stigma was largely derived from external forces, such as religion or politics, and that it actually, when they thought about it, clashed with their own values. The personal values they had, particularly a kind of African humanist approach to life and value systems, where people realized that at their core, they did not want to cause harm or hurt towards other people. And that very quickly changed. So it's just an example of how your participants may not seem to match your line of inquiry, but they do ultimately. But in pretty much all the instances I've conducted in action media, we've ended up getting towards the themes that we were interested in, largely because there's not necessarily a huge mismatch between your literature review and the research and your understanding of the community and context and the priorities and challenges of those people. I'll quickly address another question, which was the number of participants. So there are some magic numbers in action media. 15 participants is ideal, and we've pretty much consistently gotten 15 participants. That allows you to have breakout sessions in small groups of 5 people each, which is also a kind of magic number. It's enough people for dialogue. If you had 4 people, you wouldn't have enough diversity. If you had 6 people, some people wouldn't speak. So those are the kind of magic numbers there. One might think that there's participant drop-off, given that you have 2.5 days of interaction. But after the first day, participants are highly motivated to continue, particularly because the process itself is very interesting, it's fun, it's engaging, and people are curious enough to want to continue over and above what other responsibilities they might have. So those are 2 quick answers there. Antje, I don't know if you want to scan through the questions and see if you can respond to some of them as well.
Yeah, no, and these are fabulous questions. People keep bring them in, and maybe we can also, even after our time is up, kind of respond to some of them. I'm looking at Mary Packard's. Hi, Mary. Interesting questions here. What's an asset-based approach? Because I mentioned that in my section. An asset-based approach basically means like what is already there in the community. And Warren's example in South Africa, for example, was what actions do people already use to address, gender-based violence, and build on those, or what values do we already have in communities that actually, want to work together, collaborate, in Karamoja, for example. So those are assets, meaning what is already there, what's there positively that can be built on. Often we only look at, what are the gaps, what's not working. But in the action media, we can also emphasize what's working, and how can we increase that, and how can we work with values to address that practices are not living up to those values, for example. What can we do about those kind of things? The peer ethnography was an example from FHI, where we went in with action media, but the team wanted more details and then basically built on top of the action media with peer ethnography. And I can't remember even what country that was. I think that was the Caribbean. What else do we have? And hi, Eveline and Juliet and Venancio from, they can also, you can ask them about the Apollo project and what we did there. They were all involved heavily. And I just need to mention that also that Emma Kayongo was involved very heavily in the strategy development together with me, and so is the author of that interesting strategy. Please ask them about Apollo. What else? What else do you see, Warren, that you can respond?
Yeah, I'll pick up on a few. So one other observation is action media. The term seems to imply something to do with media, whereas it's kind of a lot broader than that. So I guess that was partly just how it started out, and there was the name attached to it. It's sort of subsequently become called participatory action media, or even the acronym PAM. And that's possibly a little more helpful in that it emphasizes the participatory aspect. So that's just to respond to that. I would also encourage, there are many participants who have been trained in action media or worked with action media, so do feel free to answer the questions in the text box as well. Needn't just be myself and Antje responding there, and I see Isaac had already done that for one of the questions. Thanks so much. So apart from that, essentially there was mention of drawing the line between action media and co-creation. So I think to some extent it is co-creation, but it doesn't mean that what comes out of the action media process is something that is applied directly. Often one is taking the principles and concepts that emerge through the action media process into a much broader strategic SBC strategy. So just because people in the action media sessions may develop a particular slogan or a particular concept, it's not necessarily directly implied that that will become the essence of what follows. What you're doing in action media or participatory action media is digging into the way people make meaning around things and how people make meaning of change. And that needs to be linked to what resources are available to use those insights in a program. So that would be the response to that one. Please feel free to ask questions directly, verbally as well, if anyone wants to step in there. I'm not sure, Antje, I don't know if you see any other questions that could be responded to.
Yeah, I was just, responding to the community question. When the communities basically request other things than the project wants to offer, there's ways around it. I mean, in the beginning, you can mention what the project can offer, but also if there's other needs, projects can be a lot more instrumental than they usually are to link to other projects that may work in this area of, let's say, livelihoods, poverty, reduction or climate change or whatever it is. And we can also add advocacy components to vocalize basically what the results of those action media methods with the right stakeholders. So that can all be done. It shouldn't stop us to really ask those questions. Evelyn was asking how to make sure that we have the right participants for action media, and that's a very practical, good question. I think in the case of the low literacy activity we did under Sea Change, we engaged with a project that worked on people that worked with people of low literacy, and we gave them some criteria to help us identify the right folks. Warren, do you have other tips on that? How to get the right people for action media?
Yeah, I don't know. I think one of the things that stands out for me is I've always been surprised with who we have in the room, to the extent that one doesn't always anticipate that they would have effective dialogue or have good ideas, but the methodology allows that to be unpacked. So I've not really come across situations where I feel like we've got the wrong people in the room. We have, for example, some of the work I did in Karamoja, beyond the Upper Loop project as well. We did some action media sessions, and we had young people who were typically marginalized, young women, young men, elders, and so forth in the room, and the dialogue was able to move ahead to the extent that we found incredibly profound and deep insights that were useful to programming. So I think it's just surprising how much knowledge and wisdom people have, even if they don't seem to be necessarily representing any in-depth knowledge or understanding. Through the process of dialogue, a lot is revealed. So I don't know if that really helps, but just to say that you shouldn't be too worried if you think you might have the wrong audience. The context is important, obviously, so one needs to be working in the context that you're interested in developing insights into change. And then there was a question from Mena about unfacilitated group exercises. So these are, I think, one of the really strong features of the participatory action media process is allowing small groups of participants, these groups of 5, to go and pursue a question. And the questions are typically, what are the changes you would like to see? What are the challenges that you're facing? What are your priorities for change? And then it evolves to actually looking at solutions. So these small groups then start discussing solutions to problems. And what's really nice is you can break the small groups up into sort of subsections within your group of 15. So you might have a group of young men, a group of young women, a group of adults or elders, and those can form the basis for the 3 groups of 5. So when they look at the same questions, they come up with differentiated understanding and insights into the questions asked. But the small group really functions best around a question that the small group then tackle and answer. And then they also often work together to develop concepts related to SBC. So for example, develop a song or develop a poster or map your community and look at the hotspots for risk and the safe spaces and so on. So many different exercises, but really powerful information comes out of that, I think largely due to the non-facilitation, because people are freer to speak. And then as these same groups continue throughout the process, so they develop skills in interacting, they develop confidence. When I was in Sierra Leone, for example, there was a group of young women who hadn't had much schooling and couldn't read or write, and initially seemed to be a group that might need support. But by the end of it, they were standing up and saying, we want to go first. Why do we need to go first? Well, we have to remember what we discussed because we couldn't take notes. So that's the reason. Whereas that group of young women more typically would be silent and somewhat oppressed in the setting that they were in, which included adults and young and older men and so forth. So one does see an empowerment process in that. So it's very useful there. I'll stop there and have a look at the questions again.
There was one that talked about, how when projects have time and budget restrictions, how genuine community narratives can be used. And I think that's not so much a question of time and narrative as it is to of the kind of usual the perfectionism that we put forward, where we don't let community voices in their stories live, but we're always embezzling them or making them look better than they actually are, or change the wording that people use and turn them all into little success stories, instead of kind of letting some of the complexity live in those narratives, to then help us think further, address the complexities, address the contradictions and things like that. So I think stories really need to be told by communities, not by us for them. And that takes a lot of reconsiderations on our part, and more thinking. Does that help as a response, or just the beginning of that thinking? This is also something that was emphasized at the end of the SBCC summit in Morocco.
Yeah, I think I also just wanted to add, it's very interesting to see how the empowerment aspect of participatory action media works for participants who, through this process, often reflect critically on their circumstances and on their context. So for example, recently, a couple of weeks ago, we were conducting participatory action media in Ghana. And a number of young, one of the focal areas was looking at adolescent pregnancy and to some extent sexual coercion and things like that. And a number of the participants there were particularly moved by what they'd learned through the process and reflection, and committed themselves to changing the way they were engaging in sexual relationships. For example, one of the young men said, well, through this process, I've realized that I shouldn't be exposing myself to the advice of peers who don't have my interests at heart. And he committed to shifting the way he was conducting his life and his relationships. And a lot of people in these processes do that. Obviously, the purpose of participatory action media is to lift out the findings into a program or project or sort of higher level model for change. But at the same time, many of the findings are directly applicable in the immediate communities where we conduct the research. And there is an openness to that. So it works best, obviously, if the project or program is already working in that community. But in many instances where that's possible, the project or program actually picks up on what's come out of action media at a community level, and the communities can actually apply and use the ideas they've come up with, often setting up small action groups or committees to address the issues that they've faced, and also have the benefit of some support from the project as this unfolds. They
Warren,
also, yeah.
Yeah, we need to kind of look at time here a little bit.
Okay, sure. All right, I'll just quickly wrap up as well. These communities where you've conducted action media also become interesting incubators for ongoing change processes and ideas, so they can be a place where one refers back. So I'll stop there.
And Warren, maybe just one, there are several questions here before we talk about what the next steps are in the last couple of minutes. What the difference is between action media and co-creation in HCD. And I think, co-creation it's a term that just recently came out, which is really undefined. What, we're creating together, but there's no real methodology behind it. Whereas action media clearly has a methodology that is, part of participatory action research. And as Tom said, that may be a better term for it. But it was there before co-creation and even before HCD. Both of them are kind of mixes of methods from different disciplines. And, the biggest difference, I think, is that you're looking at a formed methodology here that has been used over and over. And there's a lot of overlap. Co-creation could, action media is a version of co-creation, but co-creation doesn't have a methodology to it. It could be anything, just where we're developing things together. And at the end of the series, there will be a seminar to kind of distill between implementers of Action Media, Warren and myself, and people from, I think, Matchboxology and others who work on human-centered design, to distill a little bit more where we overlap and where there are differences. And often differences are where it's not about collective action in these methodologies, but it's about individual behavior change. So keep an eye on that. I'm handing over to Warren to talk us through the next steps on this.
Great. Yeah. So the next session in the series is going to be sorry, the key takeaways.
No. This, what are the next steps basically after this? And I hope we were able to answer some of your questions, but there is another session where we can bring in some of the questions we haven't been able to answer this time around, by the way. So over to you, Warren.
Yeah, sorry. So the next session, which as far as I recall is on the 20th of September, is sharing experiences, drawing on the work of people who've used Action Media other than myself and Antje, and sharing program experiences and applications and so forth. So I think that'll be very interesting, and it'll also provide an opportunity to get more insight into the kind of hands-on processes for conducting Action Media. And then the third part in the series looks at comparisons between Action Media and human-centered design approaches. So human-centered design has come up more recently as a kind of approach to improving the way one develops SBC concepts and so on. And there's some differences. It's a fairly sort of open-ended approach to supporting SBC, so there's not necessarily a strictly defined or closely defined methodology, whereas Action Media is much more closely defined and specific methodology. But there'll be an opportunity to engage with those similarities and differences as well. And I think, just to stress, Action Media is not the only thing out there to do this type of work or to support SBC. It does have the benefit of a long history and lots of experiences, but you really have to be committed to taking the findings that emerge through Action Media into a project or program. I'll stop there.
So back to you, Paul or Kenneth, or who's closing us off? Or when people want to ask more questions, what are we doing? Do you want us to continue, or are we at time, Paul? Or Kenneth?
I think I see a note from Paul just saying he seems to be muted, but he just needs to be unmuted.
Yeah, sorry, the host had locked me out. But wow, what a start! I think we are off to a flying start. Thank you for running the anchor leg quite well, Antje and Warren. If the team would join me to drop a message or an emoji or switch on the video and dance for the team, I think we are off to a good start. We promised a soft stop at 30 past. You can see it has been so engaging. We almost hit the century mark. But I think, given that we have more series to go, we can continue the discussions on the socials, on email and the WhatsApp group. I think Warren and Parker will be open to respond to the continuing question, and thanks for the interest. So just like I said, the next engagement will be on the 20th September. Mark your calendars and look out for the promos and the artwork that will come out. We promise it to be even more interesting, and you can give us more suggestions that make this better. With those few remarks, I'd like to thank everyone and let you go engage in the other things. We'll keep chatting and we'll talk soon. Thank you, Warren and Antje.
Great, thank you so much, and we very much appreciate the interest in this session, and I'm very pleased to hear that it's a good launch pad for the coming sessions and for the general work of the ASSBC. Thanks so much. Speaking for Antje at the same time.
Yeah, thanks everyone. The next one is, I think, more people talking, more engagement. I think we just had to set the stage. but this one was a lot more presentation. Presentation can be shared, yes, right, Warren?
Yes, so two things to share. One would be the presentation itself, and then I'd also mentioned in the presentation we'll be developing a list of resources, the journal articles I mentioned, and some of the reports that are available in the public domain, so people will have those. And then also just to add, as part of the work I'm doing in Ghana through FHI 360, one of the things we're looking at is developing a manual or a guide for implementing action media, and that might be something that may in due course become more widely available. But there is work ongoing on the methods. A lot of what's embedded in the research reports and the journal articles is informative in terms of the methodology, much beyond what we've shared here.
So next time we can also talk, about things like, how do you prioritize insights? Very important. How do you deal with the insights that come out? How do you prioritize what comes out? Very important. Thanks, everyone. I'm signing off unless there's anything else. Nice to see everyone.